Thank you for joining us today. My name is Carlos Vasquez, doctoral candidate in psychology and the host of Circle of Insight, where we discuss the topics that you have chosen with leading experts. Our motto is, wherever there's psychology involved, we will be there. Today we're discussing the psychology of religion. It's actually going to be a year-long series discussing religion in all aspects. The tough questions. Why do we have religion? Do we need a God? Why do bad things happen to good people? These are tough questions to answer, and we have some of the smartest people in the industry going to try to answer those questions for us. Today we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Robert Weathers. He's here to try to discuss the first couple of questions. Why do we have religion? And why do we need religion? Thank you very much, Dr. Weathers, for joining us today.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
And before we get started on the show, what I want to do is find out a little bit about you. What got you interested in religion and the studies of religion and the studies of psychology?
I have a couple different thoughts in response. One is that I've reviewed some of the questions that you've sent my way, and I intend to root my answers to the questions in biography, and so you'll find out more about me as we go through. I really do believe, I know what's true for me, and it emerged as I reflected on your questions, is that my answers, or I should say my reflections on your questions, are really rooted in my own personal narrative. And beyond that, I think it's the case for all of us. And so whatever answers you might have to these questions, whatever answers those in the audience might have their basis in our stories. And so more of me will be revealed as we talk today. Let me give you a real quick introductory sketch, though. As far back as I can remember, I had a self-reflective, and I'd even say a religious instinct. And this was before organized religion for me. My earliest memories are of having a sense of awe and wonder out in nature, and particularly with music. I've always had a very strong spiritual connection to music, and so that predates all the academic stuff, so I want to start with that. And if I could add one other thing, I think love relationships, family and other love relationships really had a spiritual quality to me and always have been that way. And I could tell you more about my personal history with both of my parents because they both carried this as well, but it's enough to say that I grew up in an environment, though we weren't necessarily traditional Orthodox believers in a sense. That came later in my life. I was very much grounded in spirituality, I feel like from birth. How that played out, if I skip forward about 2 or 3 decades, how that played out for me is that in college, I was a double major in college. I was interested in becoming a clinical psychologist, which I became, but I was also equally interested. In fact, I couldn't separate psychology from spirituality or from religion. And so in college, I went to a Mennonite Brethren school in Central California. It was the only school in the area that would offer what I wanted, which was a double major in psychology and religious studies. And so I got bachelor's degrees in both areas. And then when it came time for graduate school, this is the late 70s, I looked all around the country to see what program in a graduate form offered that same thing. And there was only one program in the country at that point, and I went to it, and it was a seminary here in Southern California where I got my PhD in clinical psychology. Simultaneously, I got my Master's of Arts in religious studies. And so what I had started in undergraduate, I continued into graduate school. So my bachelor's thesis was in the area of psychology and religion. My doctoral dissertation is in the area of psychology of religion. And as fate would have it, if we just kind of move forward, I moved into teaching graduate students in psychology, and that actually became my specialty there as well. So I chaired a number of dissertations that focused on this interface between psychology and religion. Maybe one last piece, there's so much I could say about this,
Sure.
Is that as if graduate school wasn't enough, I went through a 6-year graduate program to accomplish what I did. And I finished that, was out working as a university professor for a number of years, and actually went back for postgraduate studies and went back for 6 more years of postgraduate studies in psychology and religion here at the it's the C.G. Jung Institute here in Los Angeles. So I spent 6 years training in psychology of religion. So suffice it to say, I wouldn't have done this if I wasn't passionate about it. Okay, so
we do have an expert here.
Yeah, well, you certainly have a passionate person. We'll see about the expert part, but I'm happy to be here. And I think more will get fleshed out with stories and influential individuals as well as authors and so on as we address various questions. So is that good for a start?
That's wonderful.
Okay. All right.
And we do notice there seems to be a symbiotic relationship between religion and psychology.
Well, there was for me. That doesn't necessarily go that way. I had one of my first professors at this seminary in the Graduate School of Psychology had this model, kind of a separate but equal model. The idea was that religion and psychology were important, but they kind of don't have much to say to each other. And that's an arguable position. I didn't share that position, but it's so there are people that would say they're in completely different domains and kind of never the twain shall meet. I've always seen the two as primarily coextensive. I don't know how to, and I think it's implied in what you just said, Carlos. I don't know how to separate out spirituality from psychology and from psychotherapy, and in fact want to articulate how they are inseparable as we talk further.
That's wonderful. I mean, it's a very important topic. We know 97% of Americans believe in a God. And that's one of the questions we're going to talk about a little later on. Is why do we have God? Do we need a God? More in the psychological world, we're going to look for it. In history, there's been different views of God. We know there's been polytheism and monotheism and all different versions of it. Religion, a lot of times in history, has been known to be very good at organizing. Governments have used it to organize people, to control people, to keep them in check. Those are some of the historical backgrounds of religion. But we're going to start off with the big question. Why do you think we have religion?
Why do we have religion? How about if there's so many ways to answer that? And by the way, you just piqued my interest talking about the history. We'll wrap back into that when we talk about do we need a God. I want to talk about the history of religion maybe in that point. So can we just make a bookmark right there?
I'll put it down,
and I'll be happy to come back to that. But your question is why do we have religion? Why do we need religion? Let me separate those out. Why do we have religion? And let me start by addressing it from a psychological perspective, because my background is in psychology primarily, and so that's my entry point into addressing religion. A theologian, a man on the street believer would have a different entry point. This is my portal into talking about religion and spirituality. Why do we have religion? My first graduate school professor was a man named Neil Warren. And Neil Warren was the dean at that point of the graduate school. He went on to fame and fortune with eHarmony.
eHarmony,
yes. And Neil and I worked closely together. I had a number of independent studies under Neil. As it turns out, my wife at the time worked for Neil, so a very close relationship with Neil, and I learned a great deal from him. He was a very wise man. Neil, in the first year of graduate school, introduced me to, he was a humanistic existential psychologist by background and a Christian.
Okay.
And he introduced me to the work of such individuals. He had studied closely with Carl Rogers, but he introduced me to the work of Abraham Maslow as another kind of pioneer in the humanist movement here in the United States. In fact, Maslow at one point was the president of the American Psychological Association, which is kind of as high as you can get in American psychology, as being it's a nominated and voted for position. And Maslow developed what is really familiar to people in psychology. Developed a hierarchy of needs. It's a motivational hierarchy. What motivates us? And he talks about, I'm going to say 6 different motivations, and I never counted it, so it could be 7, but he starts with what motivates us, and I'm going to address why we need religion from a Maslow perspective.
Interesting.
He starts off by saying that our most basic needs are to breathe and to eat, some really basic needs. None of the rest of our life really matters if I don't have enough oxygen, honestly. And so that he said that that's a physiological foundation for our needs. When those are satisfied, the next order of needs are what he referred to as safety and security needs. And that has to do with stability in my environment, having a roof over my head, being able to count on food. And now I've got a little bit of a luxury, I can actually plan. And so that's the next set of motivators for us, our security needs, our safety
And the
needs.
first 2 are really physical.
Yeah. Primarily
Material.
physical.
Okay.
Material, physical needs. The next one isn't. As soon as those most basic needs are satisfied, we have such a fundamental drive for what is now referred to as attachment, what Maslow referred to as belongingness, is my need to connect, my need to belong is almost as radical. In fact, some people would say it is as radical as oxygen. You think of infants that were deprived of contact. After World War II, Renee Spitz studied these infants in the failure to thrive syndrome, or hospitalism, where infants died because they had no physical contact. So belongingness needs are right next to that. So we're at level 3 now. The next level, after belongingness needs are met, at least satisfactorily, are what Maslow referred to as self-esteem needs. And this is how I make a difference in the world, how I feel good about myself. In Albert Bandura's words, another psychologist who spent his career studying self-esteem, He used the word self-efficacy. Am I effective in dealing with the world? And insofar as I am, my self-esteem reflects that. Once self-esteem needs are settled, now we begin to move into the spiritual zone. And usually Maslow, the readings of Maslow that we read in textbooks stops at the next level, which would be the fifth. There's actually a sixth that he proposed right before he passed away in 1970. But this fifth one is really associated with him, and it's referred to as self-actualization needs. And this is, am I accomplishing what I was put on this planet to accomplish? And that really is the zone of our values, meaning in our life purpose, and those become very strong motivators as these other needs are well secured, let's say. Now my self-actualization needs come. It doesn't really matter if I have much meaning in my life if I can't breathe. You follow it, how they're built on one another. At the very end of his life, Maslow proposed a sixth motivator, and it gets us right into the heart of what we're talking about, but this from a psychological perspective. He says that sixth need is self-transcendence. And that puts us right in the basket of religion and or spirituality. I want to define those a little bit later, distinguish between those. I like both terms a lot. Not everybody does, but religious needs, spiritual needs, self-transcendence, that we all have wired into us for whatever reasons, and theologians have different answers than psychologists. Psychologists kind of scratch their heads. Theologians will have, and philosophers will have a different answer, and I'll get to that in just a second in terms of why we need religion. But for Maslow, it was enough to say that we have a need, and it's built into us, to transcend just ourselves, whether it's passing on our legacy with our children, making a difference in terms of providing scientific or artistic creativity that will further the world, that will improve the world station.
So you're saying it's safe to say it's almost genetic?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't think that Maslow would say that. I think somebody who would say that's a very good question. In recent books, Daniel Siegel has been saying that. Daniel Siegel is a local neuropsychiatrist here at UCLA, and in recent books, he's been discussing this, and I cannot remember his technical term right now, shame on me, but he's been discussing how it is that we've got a need that's wound into our neurobiology that has to do with what Maslow would, or it's a parallel to what Maslow would call self-transcendence. So it's a good point. If you ask Carl Jung, the kind of the primary or the prize pupil of Freud, he would answer yes, and he would have framed it in terms of, yes, we do have it wound into our genetics, and he talked about it in terms of the collective unconscious. There's your personal unconscious, Carlos, and there's Bob Weather's personal unconscious, and there's the collective that we inherit influences from the biological past that may be passed genetically, may be passed communication-wise down from one generation to the next, but it might as well be genetic. So I'll leave that to the geneticists, but I will mention just a couple words before we wrap up this initial response. In graduate school, I had a chance to study theology and philosophy. But before graduate school, I had a professor. I went to Fresno Pacific University. I mentioned it earlier. It was a Mennonite Brethren school, and my favorite theology professor there was a man named Howard Lowen. Howard was from Canada, and he was a wonderfully articulate professor. He actually had been a student at Fuller Seminary, where I ended up going before I went there, and he came back, and Howard introduced me to philosophy. Really, I didn't have any background in philosophy or theology. As fate would have it, Howard eventually moved beyond Fresno Pacific, came back to Fuller, and he's now the dean of theology at Fuller. So here's somebody who's been really influential, and very happy to give acknowledgement to Howard, because he really introduced me piece by piece to really what's quite complex, in terms of contemporary theology. But I can remember classes with Howard where he would say that this need that we're talking about, this need for religion, is what philosophers would call, it's ontological. And ontological, just a technical term for it's wound into our being or our marrow. And from a physiological perspective, from a medical perspective, we might look at it in terms of genetics. From a psychological perspective, we might look at it the way that Carl Jung looked at it in terms of the collective unconscious. But whatever way it is, that it's wound into who we are. Howard was a student of what's called patristic theology, which would be the early theology of the Christian church. And so, for example, he was a student of St. Augustine, and I remember him quoting St. Augustine on this point, and I'm going to read it because I don't have it committed to heart, but it's beautiful what St. Augustine said in terms of why do we have religion.
And his book Confessions? Is that from his book Confessions?
Yes, it's from Confessions. He said, this is a prayer to God. He says, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you."
That is pretty.
Another author talks about it, that we have a God-shaped vacuum inside of us that won't be satisfied unless filled with God. So there's different entry points into that. I'll leave the roots of that to the geneticists and the theologians, but it gets at something from a psychological perspective that it's absolutely essential to who we are as individuals.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Religion has a lot of grades, in a sense. There's a lot of degrees of religion. There's a religion in the sense of people who take it to a really extreme. And what I mean by that is the whole life is dictated by religion. Everything they do is by religion. They can rationalize things away. They can kill for their religion.
For sure, yeah.
We've seen that over the centuries. Different types of religions have done it. They can go against conventional mores.
I read a statistic just recently that 100 million human beings were killed in the last century, the 20th. 100 million. We killed 100 million of ourselves in the last century, and the vast majority were over religion.
Yeah.
So it just gives you a sense of what you're saying, the scope of it.
And I guess for me, that kind of leads me to the question of, does religion somehow give us a purpose? Does it give certain people a purpose, a goal? Because maybe they don't have one, or whatever it is that's going on. I'm not trying to denigrate anybody, but I'm just trying to figure out, what does religion do?
Yeah. Let me address that. I mentioned Neil Warren before. Neil also introduced me to the existential philosophers, primarily Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, and the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard. I read a lot of Kierkegaard in graduate school. I still have Kierkegaard by my bedside, kind of evening meditations with Kierkegaard. They were both kind of the founding fathers of what's referred to as existential philosophy. Now, Nietzsche was not a believer. Kierkegaard was deeply religious. I went to Copenhagen some years ago and went to the church where he preached, and they have a museum in Copenhagen, and it was clear that he was a very devout believer. Though unorthodox, he was a very devout believer. And at any rate, what Friedrich Nietzsche had to say about this issue, you ask about purpose. Does religion provide a purpose? Friedrich Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live can deal with almost any how." And if we kind of unpack that a little bit, if I have a meaning or a purpose, a direction to my existence, almost any what, almost any how can be managed, no matter what life brings to me, if I have that purpose in mind. In fact, I'll tell you who really amplified this for me, and I also got this as a gift from Neil Warren, was reading Viktor Frankl. You probably read Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. It's a short little book, but I read it in one night, my first year in graduate school. Really impacted me. I've never read it since then, and it's like emblazoned in my psyche. For those of you that are familiar with him, you'll know his story, but just briefly, Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist. In fact, I heard Viktor Frankl speak here in the United States a number of years ago, right before he passed away. And as he was speaking, he was telling stories. He's the only person I'll ever know that actually knew Freud. Viktor Frankl knew Freud. And it wasn't that made my eyes tear. I'll tell you what made my eyes tear up is that he was deported to Auschwitz and spent World War II in Auschwitz and Buchenwald, 2 concentration camps, and was one of the few survivors. And as he was, and he writes about this in Man's Search for Meaning, I highly recommend it. If you're going to read 10 books in psychology, this would be one of the 10 in my opinion. And while he was there, he wrote notes for a book on tissues and saved these tissues and then expanded that into a book once he survived. He had no no knowledge at all he would survive. In fact, all of his family members were executed. And Frankl was vastly influenced by the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, and this phrase that I just quoted is actually also quoted in Viktor Frankl's book, He Who Has a Why to Live. And Viktor Frankl said that the people that survive the atrocities of such extremes, unimaginable extremes, 201 are the people that have some meaning, some purpose for being there beyond just base survival. And so it would manifest as altruism. It's where you reach out to care for me, and that becomes the meaning for your day. It's where you extend yourself to not reduce yourself to being less than an animal, that you really, that this is your circumstance, and you're going to find some way to not lose your humanity, not give over your autonomy. And he writes about this so eloquently. And he said, those who survived 201 were the ones that had purpose in their lives. And he grants that religious value in the sense that, well, I'll say more about religion in just a moment. Those who don't have this died, and they would die sometimes of just broken hearts. They would give up. It reminds me a little bit of Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness.
Yeah.
If you don't have something that gets you out of bed in the morning, no matter what your situation is, and thank goodness most of us don't have to be exposed to that extreme of human condition, if you don't have something to motivate you from within, a direction that you're headed, that you move into that zone of learned helplessness, and in an extreme situation like the German concentration camps where you die, you physically die.
I just want to make sure the audience realizes Circle of Insight tries to get a comprehensive picture out of every topic we discuss.
Yeah.
So right now we're looking at religion in a different sense, maybe than some of you may have looked at it. We're looking more of a utility, a function of religion, gives people purpose in their life. So I don't want you to think we're spiritual or not spiritual. We're just looking at it in very different lenses.
Let me address spirituality and religion for just a second, a definition thing. My introduction to religious studies, those were my degrees, it was honorable. You know, religion, the term religion was honorable. In fact, I remember studying very early on that the etymology of the word religion is interesting. If you think of the word for a ligament, how a ligament connects our joints, that the lig part, the Latin word is religio, that ligio comes from the same root as ligament or ligature. And religature is to religature or religament something that's been broken or separated. And so the etymology of it, if you look at it more from a literary perspective, is it's to reconnect us to the very things that you just mentioned. It's to reconnect myself to the purpose, the meaning, the value of my life. In the Western traditions, Judeo-Christian traditions, we call that God. It's to be reconnected to God or to be reconnected to heaven, because that natural ligament has been broken. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's the story of the fall, the Garden of Eden and the fall, and that we need to be reconnected with God. And the Jewish tradition has its own metaphors and stories around that and ways of getting to that. The Christian tradition has its own way of doing that. But in essence, they're about religaturing ourselves to the kingdom of heaven. Spirituality in the last, it's really the last few decades, it's become more the hip term, and religion is no longer the hip term. And so people will oftentimes say, and I understand what they mean, I don't really subscribe to this, but people will say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. In fact, if you interview Americans, there's a significant portion of Americans, 40-50% of Americans will say, I'm not religious, I am spiritual. And what they mean, and it gets at the statistic you just shared, what they mean is that I have a relationship to the transcendent, God, the divine, whatever language you'd use for that, but I don't care to join in with the organized expression of that in churches, synagogues, and so on. So you get plenty of people that are unchurched nowadays, untempled nowadays, that hold to a spirituality, but it's not orthodox and it's also independent of your traditional groups. And so,
Now that leads me to another question.
Okay.
What do those things have? What kind of benefits do those things have in a sense of being able to go to church once a week, for instance, doing the religious, praying every morning, praying every night?
Yeah.
The religion has these rituals, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And I know that's another question that we have on there. But what does that bring psychologically? I'm sure there are benefits. We know there's physiological benefits in the brain. We've seen that from studies from Dr. Newberg. He was showing studies on that. What do you think it brings to people? Does it bring comfort, security?
Yeah, the study of myth and ritual is a whole domain unto itself. It's kind of a subcategory. There are so many, under the umbrella of religious studies, there's so many different ways to go.
Yeah.
When I was in seminary, I studied under two cultural anthropologists, Chuck Kraft and Paul Hebert. They were actually my two favorite professors in graduate school, interestingly, were anthropologists. It wasn't the theologians and it wasn't the psychologists.
They're fun.
It was the anthropologists. Chuck had spent his career in West Africa as a Christian missionary and came back and studied anthropology and then taught at Fuller. And Paul Hebert had done the same thing, except he was from India, and they both had enormous impact on me. I almost did my doctoral dissertation under Chuck Kraft at Fuller, even though I was in psychology. It would have been a trick to pull that off, but I was very, very touched. They both introduced me to the work of Mircea Eliade, he's a student of the history of religion, speaking of history of religions, and also has written probably more about myth and ritual and been more influential in the domain of study of religion than anybody. Mircea Eliade. The last name is Eliada, and D-E, and he has a number of books on myth and ritual, and looks at what is it about going to church? What is it about praying? What is it about my belief that makes a difference? And I'll tell you what I'm reminded of is that early on in college I studied philosophy, and I was introduced to the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who's kind of a forefather of Western philosophy. And Kant made a distinction. I'm going to tie it into myth and ritual in a second. Kant said that there's two realms. There's the phenomenal realm, which is the realm of you and me here, physically, tangibly. And that's the world in which we live, the world of phenomena. And there's another realm behind that owing to the fact that we're limited with our five senses, we're limited to certain ways of configuring space, like the distance between you and me, Carlos, or the fact that my watch is moving and we can divide up time. But Kant's position is that those are all phenomena. Space, distance, time, chronological time. Those are all in the realm of phenomena, but those are a function of the way that our minds are built or our brains are built. And that doesn't mean that's the way reality is. That's the way that we ascertain reality. I can only see what my eyes are able to see. Flies see a whole bunch of different stuff that I don't see, I understand. And dogs hear a bunch of stuff I don't hear, and so on. So Kant acknowledged that as hugely beneficial as our brains are, there are limitations. And Kant's idea is that beyond the world of phenomena, or what he referred to as the noumenal realm, you might as well put an equal sign. The noumenal realm would equal what most people refer to as the spiritual. So there's the world of this bottle of water that's physical and tangible, and then there's the world behind all of this that we get intimations of in our dreams, in our aha experiences. Maslow called them peak experiences, where we get a glimpse, literally a peek into another reality. And those tend to be the things that we remember at the end of our lives. Those are the things that we tend to remember as being most meaningful. And ironically, they're not in the phenomenal realm.
That's very interesting.
One author puts it this way. He says, everything that matters most, and he lists them: love, beauty, creativity, joy, inner peace. Every one of those things arises from beyond the mind. Think about it. I can't think my way into beauty. You can take me to a sunset tonight, Carlos, and say, Bob, I want you to think some beauty now. And it's almost inversely proportional. The harder I think about having a beautiful sunset, the less likely it's going to be that I'm going to see a beautiful sunset. In other words, I have to relax into being taken by the sun, by the sunset. There's an existential psychologist, Rollo May, very much a contemporary of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers and some of the others that were the forefathers of humanistic existential psychology. I heard Rollo May at a conference towards the end of his life too, where he said, he said the most important thing in life is to be surprised. And he broke it down into its Latin etymology, and he said, to be surprised, he said, sur, if we break down surprise, sur is above, like to surmount. Sur is the Latin prefix for above. And prize, I wouldn't know this if you didn't tell me, prize comes from the same root of our word for prehension. If you think of like a monkey with a prehensile tail, if you've ever been to the zoo where a monkey can grab a hold of something and swing from one branch with his tail, that's called a prehensile tail. It's also the root of comprehension, apprehension, these kinds of things. It literally means to be taken. a prehensile tail can take something, and so to prehend is to take, is the Latin root. So literally, to be surprised is to be taken from above. And so if I wind this back to Kant and back to your question about what's the purpose of myth and ritual, is they open us up, our beliefs, our stories, the transformative images, the symbols in our lives that Jung studied for his entire career, and then the rituals that we utilize to access those. What those do is those open us up to surprise. Those open us up beyond just our workaday mind. And as I said earlier in that previous quote, everything that's of value in our life, as beautiful as the phenomenal realm is, everything that's of value in our life really finds its root in the noumenal or the spiritual. So anything that we can do to host or encourage that, open up the portal, that's in support of this fundamental hunger or need that we're talking about. We're calling it the religious instinct for now, that it's absolutely wound into us. These represent the pivotal, cardinal moments of our lives. And the more that we can cultivate spirituality in our lives, and we can talk more about that, the more we can cultivate that, the higher. You can't make it happen. I can't make beauty happen, but it does help to go with you to the beach. And if we go every night, chances are I'm going to be gobsmacked. I'm going to be surprised by the sunset.
That's wonderful. Incredible, unbelievable insight from Dr. Weathers today as we tackle the very first question in our series, why do we have religion? As you can tell, it's a very complicated question. It has many directions, many possible answers. Wonderful subject. Thank you again, Dr. Weathers.
Welcome. Thank you.
Part 2 is coming up, so we don't want you to miss that. Once again, all opinions expressed here are not necessarily of the host, Circle of Insight O Therapy Cable. Thank you very much for joining us.